The restaurant buzzed with the soft hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the subdued tones of a live piano. James Whittaker walked in, exuding confidence in his tailored charcoal suit. His hand rested lightly on Rachel's lower back as he guided her through the entrance. Rachel, radiant in a sleek red dress, flashed a warm smile, clearly enjoying the attention she received from other patrons. For James, it was just another night in one of New York's finest establishments. The host greeted them with a polished charm, quickly leading them to a table near the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights twinkled in the background, setting the perfect ambience for the evening. James pulled out Rachel's chair, earning a soft thank you before he took his seat. Everything felt perfectly orchestrated until his eyes landed on her. It wasn't the glow of the candles or the glimmer of crystal stemware that caught his attention. It was Avellini. James froze, his hand gripping the edge of the table. There she was, moving gracefully between tables, balancing a tray of dishes as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on her shoulders. Her dark auburn hair was tied back, exposing her delicate features. But it wasn't just her presence that struck him like a thunderbolt. Avellini was pregnant. The sight sent a jolt through James, like stepping into icy water. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He hadn't seen her in over 7 months, not since the divorce. And now, here she was, a child clearly on the way, working as a waitress in a place like this. Rachel tilted her head, her brows knitting together in concern. "James? Are you okay?" James blinked, forcing his gaze away from Avellini. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. He picked up the menu and pretended to study it, though the words blurred on the page. Avellini hadn't noticed him yet, or at least, that's what he told himself. She moved between tables with practiced ease, her expression calm and professional. But James saw the slight stiffness in her posture, the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes. He'd once known her every nuance, every subtle change in her demeanor. And now, he was reading her all over again, the memories rushing back uninvited. When she finally approached their table, James's heart thudded against his ribcage. Avellini stopped a few feet away, holding her notepad and pen with practiced composure. "Good evening. Welcome to Paragon. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Her voice was smooth and steady, betraying no hint of recognition. James swallowed hard. "Water's fine," he managed, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. Rachel smiled politely. "I'll have a house white, please." Avellini nodded, scribbling their orders down without looking directly at James. As she turned to leave, her gaze flickered toward him, just for a second. In that brief glance, James saw it, the flash of recognition, quickly masked by professional detachment. It was like a knife twisting in his chest. "Do you know her?" Rachel's question was casual, but there was a trace of curiosity in her tone. James hesitated. "She's someone I used to know." Rachel didn't press further, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. James felt the weight of her gaze, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Avellini, pregnant, working here of all places. Questions swirled in his mind like a storm. Was she married again? Was the child hers and someone else's? Why hadn't he heard anything about this? The night dragged on, though James barely noticed the passing of time. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and Rachel laughed at all the right moments. But James's mind remained anchored to the woman moving silently between the tables. He stole glances at her whenever he could, his chest tightening with every step she took. Toward the end of the evening, James couldn't take it anymore. When Avellini came to clear their plates, he mustered the courage to speak. "Avellini," he said softly, almost inaudibly. Her hand paused, the plate she was holding trembling slightly before she steadied it. She didn't look at him, her face a mask of professionalism. "Is there something else you need, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. James flinched at the formality. "Can we talk? Just for a moment?" Avellini straightened, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her green eyes were guarded, her expression unreadable. "I'm working, James," she said simply, before turning and walking away. The finality in her tone stung, and James sank back into his chair, the weight of her dismissal heavier than he'd anticipated. Rachel, sensing the shift in his mood, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "James, is everything okay? You seem distracted." He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. As they left the restaurant, James lingered near the entrance, his gaze drifting back toward Avellini. She didn't look his way again. And as the door swung shut behind him, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just glimpsed a chapter of his life he wasn't ready to close. The city was quiet as James drove Rachel home, the hum of the car engine the only sound breaking the silence. Rachel had attempted small talk, commenting on the evening and the quality of the meal, but James's responses had been clipped and distracted. Finally, sensing his mood, she fell silent, leaving him alone with his thoughts. When James dropped her off at her apartment, Rachel leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. "Good night, James," she said softly, her expression thoughtful as she stepped out of the car. She hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but eventually closed the door and disappeared inside. James sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty passenger seat. His mind was a storm, swirling with memories of Avellini. He hadn't allowed himself to think of her for months. He'd buried their time together deep, convincing himself that their story was over. But tonight had shattered that illusion. With a sigh, James put the car in gear and headed home. The penthouse apartment was immaculate, a showcase of his wealth and taste, but it felt cold and empty as he stepped inside. He poured himself a drink and sank onto the leather couch, staring out at the city skyline. And then, like a floodgate opening, the memories came. He thought back to the first time he'd met Avellini. It had been at a small bookstore, of all places. She'd been crouched on the floor, flipping through a collection of poetry, her auburn hair falling in soft waves around her face. James had been immediately captivated by her quiet beauty, her calm presence in a world that often felt loud and chaotic. Their first date had been at a little cafe in Brooklyn, where they'd talked for hours about books, art, and their dreams for the future. Avellini had been an aspiring writer back then, full of passion and hope. James had been drawn to her optimism, her belief in the beauty of life. He had loved her fiercely, at least in the beginning. Their wedding had been small and intimate, a celebration of their shared love rather than a display of wealth. James could still remember the way Avellini had looked at him that day, her eyes shining with happiness and trust. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. As James's career began to take off, his focus shifted to his business. The long hours, the late nights, the constant pressure to succeed, it had consumed him. Avellini had tried to be understanding, but he could see now how his absence had worn on her. He remembered the arguments, the growing distance between them. Avellini had tried to talk to him, to make him see what was happening, but he dismissed her concerns, too caught up in his own world to truly listen. And then, one day, she'd had enough. "I can't do this anymore, James," she'd said, her voice breaking as she packed her things. "I feel like I've lost you, and I'm losing myself trying to hold us together." James had been stunned, unable to process her words. He'd told himself it was just a rough patch, that they could work through it. But by the time he'd realized how serious she was, it was too late. The divorce papers had arrived, and Avellini had walked out of his life. He had thrown himself even deeper into his work after that, using it as a distraction from the ache in his chest. But now, seeing her again, pregnant, working as a waitress, it brought everything rushing back. The love, the regret, the guilt. And most of all, the question that haunted him now, was the baby his? James downed the rest of his drink, the burn of the alcohol doing little to dull the pain. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep, not with everything swirling in his mind. Instead, he got up and went to his study, pulling open the drawer where he kept a small box of mementos from his past. Inside was a photo of him and Avellini on their honeymoon, smiling and carefree. He traced a finger over her face, the memories both a comfort and a knife to his heart. The next morning, James woke with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He needed answers. More than that, he needed to understand what had happened to Avellini after their divorce. He couldn't shake the image of her, pregnant and working so hard, out of his mind. There had to be more to the story. He called his assistant, Greg, and gave him a task. "I need you to find someone for me," James said, keeping his tone casual. "Her name is Avellini Carter." Greg didn't ask questions, simply acknowledging the request with his usual efficiency. James hung up, already feeling a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He knew he was reopening a door he'd thought closed forever, but he couldn't ignore the pull. That evening, as he sat in his office waiting for Greg's report, James allowed himself to reflect on the man he'd been during his marriage. He'd been ambitious, driven, and, in many ways, selfish. He'd told himself it was all for them, for their future, but he could see now how hollow that excuse had been. Avellini had needed him, not his money, and he'd failed her. When Greg finally called back, James's heart pounded as he picked up the phone. "I found her," Greg said. "She's living in a small apartment in Brooklyn. Looks like she's been working at that restaurant for a while now. There's no record of a current partner." James's breath caught at the last part. No partner. Could that mean? He pushed the thought aside, thanking Greg before ending the call. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to talk to Avellini, to find out the truth, not just about the baby, but about everything. As James sat back in his chair, staring out at the city, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Fear of facing the pain he'd caused and the mistakes he'd made. But hope, too, hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. James stood outside the restaurant, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat to guard against the evening chill. The glow from the restaurant's sign cast a soft light over the sidewalk, and he felt a pang of uncertainty. Avellini had made it clear during dinner service that she didn't want to talk to him, but James wasn't ready to walk away, not again. As the door swung open, releasing a burst of warmth and chatter, Avellini stepped out. She wore a long gray coat over her uniform, her hair pulled back into the same neat bun she'd had all night. The sight of her, illuminated by the streetlights, momentarily stole James's words. "Avellini," he finally managed, his voice soft but insistent. She froze mid-step, her shoulders stiffening as she turned to face him. Her eyes met his, guarded and cool. "James," she said flatly. "What are you doing here?" "I just want to talk," he said, taking a step closer. "Please." Avellini hesitated, glancing toward the street as if weighing her options. She finally let out a sigh, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't have time for this." "I know I don't deserve your time," James said quickly. "But seeing you tonight, it brought back everything. I didn't know about the baby." Her eyes narrowed, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. "It's none of your business." "Is it mine?" The question came out before James could stop himself, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Avellini's expression flickered, hurt, anger, and something else he couldn't quite place. "You don't get to ask that," she said sharply. "Not after how you left." James flinched as if struck. "I didn't leave, Avellini." "You did. You gave me no choice." Her voice rose, but she quickly caught herself, looking around as if afraid of drawing attention. She lowered her tone, her words cutting. "You were never there, James. I was alone long before I walked out that door." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. She was right, and he knew it. The truth of her statement hung between them, heavy and unspoken for far too long. James paused, running a hand through his hair. "I want to help. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Avellini shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You think you can fix this with money? That's always been your answer, hasn't it?" "It's not about money," he said quickly, his voice firm. "I know I messed up. I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me. But please, let me be here now." Avellini stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if trying to discern his sincerity. Finally, she shook her head again, her voice softer this time. "I don't need anything from you, James. Not now, not ever." Her words hit him harder than he expected, but before he could respond, she turned and walked away. He watched her go, her figure disappearing into the night, the ache in his chest growing with every step she took. The next morning, James sat in his office, unable to focus. The city sprawled out before him, the view from his penthouse office both beautiful and meaningless. For the first time in years, work didn't seem to matter. Avellini's words played on a loop in his head, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You think you can fix this with money?" She was right. That had always been his default, to throw money at a problem, to solve things with resources rather than time or effort. But this wasn't something he could buy his way out of. If he wanted to be part of Avellini's life, he'd have to earn it. The question that gnawed at him now was how. How could he prove to her that he wasn't the same man she'd walked away from? How could he show her that he'd changed, that he could be the person she needed? His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. It was Greg, his assistant. "I looked into Avellini Carter like you asked," Greg said. "She's living in a small apartment in Brooklyn. No current partner on record, and she's been working at that restaurant for about 6 months." James felt a pang of guilt hearing how modest her life had become. She deserved better. "Thanks, Greg," he said. "That'll be all for now." He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He didn't know where to go from here, but one thing was clear, he couldn't walk away. Not this time. That evening, James found himself back in Brooklyn, standing across the street from the apartment building Greg had mentioned. The place was modest but well kept, its red brick exterior illuminated by the golden glow of streetlights. He hesitated, unsure if showing up unannounced would make things worse. But as he stared at the building, his resolve hardened. He wasn't here to disrupt Avellini's life. He was here to make amends, to offer his help, quietly, if that's what she needed. Whatever it took to prove that he cared, that he was ready to be there for her, he would do it. James turned and walked away, his mind already racing with plans. If Avellini wouldn't let him help directly, he'd find another way. James sat in his office the next morning, staring blankly at the emails cluttering his screen. His usual sharp focus was nowhere to be found. Instead, his mind was consumed with Avellini, her defiance, her exhaustion, and, above all, the question he couldn't escape, was the baby his? His assistant Greg knocked lightly before stepping inside. "Got a moment?" he asked, holding a folder. "Yeah, come in," James said, sitting up straighter. Greg handed him the folder and took a step back. "I pulled everything you asked for. She's living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, 3rd floor. Single bedroom unit. Seems like she's been working at the restaurant for half a year now. No recent financial transactions that suggest she has a partner or significant outside support." James opened the folder and scanned the contents. There were printed records, nothing invasive, just publicly available information. Avellini's address, her employment records, and other mundane details filled the pages. He paused at the photo clipped to one of the documents. It showed the exterior of her apartment building, a modest, red brick structure that stood in stark contrast to the luxury James was accustomed to. "Anything else?" James asked, his voice quiet. Greg hesitated before answering. "No indication she's in a relationship. No sign of family in the area, either. Seems like she's on her own." James nodded, dismissing Greg with a quiet thanks. When he was alone again, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the photo. Avellini's life now was so far removed from the one they'd shared. The thought filled him with both guilt and determination. She might have shut him out, but that didn't mean he couldn't find a way to support her. Later that day, James called the restaurant. He kept his tone polite but firm as he asked to speak with the manager. When a man named Peter came on the line, James introduced himself and got straight to the point. "I'd like to arrange for some assistance for one of your employees," James said. Her name is Avellini Carter. There was a pause on the other end. Is she in trouble? No, nothing like that, James reassured him. I'd just like to cover any outstanding medical bills she might have, as well as ensure she has paid leave when she needs it. I'd prefer to remain anonymous. Peter hesitated. I'm not sure if I can. I'll make it worth your while, James interrupted, his voice steady but firm. You'll receive a generous donation for the restaurant. I just want to make sure she's taken care of. After a long pause, Peter finally agreed. James ended the call and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a small step, but it was something. If Avellini wouldn't let him help directly, he'd find other ways to ease her burdens. The next week, Avellini sat at her small kitchen table, a stack of bills spread out before her. The numbers were daunting, and she felt the familiar weight of anxiety settling over her. Between the rent, utilities, and upcoming medical expenses, it was hard to see how she'd manage. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She frowned when she saw the number. It was the hospital's billing department. Bracing herself, she answered. Ms. Carter, I'm calling to inform you that your account has been settled in full, the voice on the other end said cheerfully. Avellini blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. I'm sorry, what? Your outstanding balance has been paid. You're clear to schedule any follow-up appointments without concern. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who paid it? She asked, her voice sharp. I'm afraid I can't disclose that information, the representative said. But rest assured, everything is taken care of. Avellini ended the call, her chest tight with a mixture of relief and frustration. She didn't need to guess who was responsible. James. Of course it was him. Her first instinct was anger. How dare he interfere? But beneath that anger was something more complicated. Gratitude. And a pang of something she couldn't quite name. That evening, Avellini confronted Peter at the restaurant. Did you tell him to pay my bills? She asked, her voice low but firm. Peter looked uncomfortable. I didn't tell him anything, he said. But he offered a donation to the restaurant. I didn't see any harm in letting him help you. Avellini's jaw tightened. She didn't have the energy to argue further. Instead, she finished her shift in tense silence, her thoughts racing. Why couldn't James just leave her alone? And yet, as much as she wanted to push him away, part of her couldn't ignore the fact that his gesture had eased a burden she'd been carrying alone for months. Meanwhile, James continued to wrestle with his own emotions. Helping Avellini from a distance wasn't enough. He wanted to be part of her life again, not just as someone who could write checks, but as someone who could be there for her in the ways he hadn't been before. His resolve deepened as he thought about the baby. If it was his child, he needed to know. And if it wasn't, he still couldn't walk away. Avellini had been a part of his life once, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be again. Late one night, James found himself parked outside her apartment building. The lights in her windows were on, a soft glow spilling out into the dark street. He wanted to go to her, to explain everything he'd been feeling. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he sat there for a long while, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him, before finally driving away. Avellini wasn't surprised when she saw James standing outside the restaurant again a few evenings later. His tailored coat and polished shoes contrasted starkly with the modest surroundings of the neighborhood, making him stand out even more than usual. She sighed, already bracing herself for another round of whatever he had to say. As she walked out, clutching her coat tightly against the chill, he stepped forward. His expression was serious, but there was something softer in his eyes this time, something almost vulnerable. Avellini, he started, his tone quiet but earnest. Can we talk? Please. She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was another confrontation in public. With a reluctant nod, she gestured toward a small coffee shop down the street. Fine. 5 minutes. They walked in silence, the tension between them palpable. Once inside, they chose a secluded corner booth. Avellini crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on him. What do you want? James. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. I know you're upset with me. I know I've made mistakes. But I'm not here to fight with you. She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Then why are you here? I want to help, he said simply. And not just with money. Avellini let out a sharp laugh. Of course not. Because that would be too easy. I mean it, James insisted, his voice firm. I know I wasn't there for you before. I know I failed you. But I'm trying to change, Avellini. I want to be there for you now, for you and for the baby. Her eyes narrowed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You don't even know if the baby is yours, James. Then tell me, he said, leaning closer. Is it? Avellini froze, her breath catching. She hadn't expected him to be so direct. Her silence spoke volumes, and James's expression shifted, hope flickering briefly before he masked it with calm determination. It is, isn't it? He asked softly. Her shoulders sagged as she exhaled slowly, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his question. Yes, she admitted. The baby is yours. James's heart pounded in his chest. A strange mixture of emotions flooded him, relief, guilt, and a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt before. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice tinged with pain. Avellini met his gaze, her eyes hard. Because you weren't there, James. You were always too busy, too distracted. I didn't think you cared enough to be part of this. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. And now you think you can just show up and fix everything? Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me? Working long hours, dealing with this pregnancy alone, trying to figure out how I'm going to provide for this baby? James shook his head, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't know. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. But I see it now, Avellini. And I want to make it right. Make it right, she repeated, her tone bitter. You think showing up out of nowhere is going to make up for everything? No, he said quietly. I know it's not that simple. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Whether you want me involved or not, I'm going to do everything I can to support you and the baby. Avellini stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. What she saw there gave her pause. For the first time, she saw a man who seemed genuinely remorseful, who was willing to do whatever it took to be part of her life again. Words are easy, James, she said finally. It's your actions that matter. He nodded. I understand. And I'll prove it to you. Over the next few weeks, James made good on his promise. He didn't push Avellini for more conversations or try to insert himself into her life uninvited. Instead, he focused on small, thoughtful gestures. He sent groceries to her apartment, arranged for a cleaner to help with the heavier tasks, and quietly covered any additional medical expenses she incurred. At first, Avellini resisted his help, her pride making it difficult to accept. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to see that his actions weren't about control or guilt, they were about genuine care. Slowly, her resentment began to soften. One evening, as she sat on her couch flipping through a book, her phone buzzed with a text from James. James, I hope the groceries arrived okay. Let me know if there's anything else you need. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back a simple reply. Avellini, thank you. They did. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Despite the progress they were making, Avellini couldn't ignore the doubts that lingered in the back of her mind. Could she really trust James again? Could he truly change, or was this just another fleeting attempt to assuage his guilt? Those questions weighed on her heavily as her pregnancy advanced. She knew she had to think not just about herself, but about the baby. The last thing she wanted was to invite James back into her life only for him to disappoint her, and their child, all over again. One rainy afternoon, Avellini found herself sitting in her doctor's office for a routine checkup. As the doctor discussed the baby's progress, her thoughts drifted to James. She hated to admit it, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe he could be the man she needed him to be. When she left the office, she found James waiting outside. He held an umbrella, shielding himself from the rain, his expression unreadable. "Avellini," he said, stepping toward her. "Can I walk you home?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. As they walked together in silence, the sound of raindrops filling the gaps between their words, Avellini found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest glimmer of hope. The weeks passed with a quiet rhythm as Avellini adjusted to James's steady presence. He remained respectful of her boundaries, never overstepping but always offering help when needed. Despite her initial resistance, she couldn't deny that his support had made a difference. Groceries were always stocked, her apartment was tidier than it had been in months, and her doctor's visits felt less daunting knowing the bills were no longer a looming threat. But even as Avellini began to soften toward James, she struggled with her doubts. Trust wasn't something she could rebuild overnight, especially not with the weight of their history between them. And now, with the baby's arrival growing closer, her emotions were more turbulent than ever. One chilly evening, Avellini stood in her small kitchen, brewing tea to calm her frayed nerves. She had been feeling off all day, an unusual tightness in her abdomen, a lingering fatigue that seemed heavier than normal. At first, she chalked it up to a long shift at work, but as the hours wore on, the discomfort turned into a sharp pain that stole her breath. She gripped the edge of the counter, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Panic bubbled in her chest as she realized something wasn't right. Fumbling for her phone, she managed to call her doctor, who urged her to go to the hospital immediately. Avellini hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to go alone, but the only person she could think to call was James. Her fingers hovered over his name in her contacts before she pressed the button. The phone barely rang twice before his voice came through. "Avellini?" His tone was alert, concerned. I think something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to go to the hospital." "I'm on my way," he said without hesitation. Within 15 minutes, James was at her door. His face was a mask of worry as he helped her into his car, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. The drive to the hospital was a blur, punctuated only by Avellini's shallow breaths and James's quiet reassurances. When they arrived, the medical staff quickly took over, wheeling Avellini into an examination room while James paced the waiting area. Time seemed to crawl as he replayed every moment of the drive in his mind, his heart pounding with fear. He had never felt so helpless. Finally, a nurse approached him. "Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. James nodded, stepping forward. "How is she?" "She's stable for now, but we're monitoring her closely," the nurse said. The baby's heart rate was elevated, and there were signs of early contractions. "We're working to prevent preterm labor, but it's going to be a long night." James thanked her and hurried to Avellini's room. When he entered, he found her lying on the hospital bed, her face pale but her expression calm. The sight of her hooked up to monitors sent a pang of guilt and worry through him. "You didn't have to stay," she said softly as he took a seat beside her bed. "Of course I did," he replied firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a while, the beeping of the monitors filling the room. James reached for her hand, hesitating for a moment before gently wrapping his fingers around hers. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was going to lose the baby." James tightened his grip on her hand. "You're not alone in this, Avellini. I promise you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, as if afraid to show her vulnerability. But James didn't let go, his presence steady and grounding. The hours dragged on as the medical team worked to stabilize Avellini and ensure the baby's safety. James stayed by her side the entire time, fetching water, adjusting her blankets, and doing whatever he could to make her more comfortable. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, patient, attentive, and deeply committed. By the early morning, the contractions had subsided, and the doctor assured them that both Avellini and the baby were out of immediate danger. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but relief was evident in her tired smile. "You should go home and rest," she said as James helped adjust her pillows. "I'll rest when I know you're okay," he replied, his tone gentle but resolute. Avellini looked at him, her defenses slipping for a brief moment. "Thank you," she murmured. "For being here." James nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Always." Later that day, after Avellini had been discharged and settled back at home, she sat on the couch with a blanket draped over her lap. James had insisted on staying to help, and though she'd initially protested, she couldn't deny that having him there made her feel safer. As he brought her a cup of tea, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding, a fragile but growing trust. "James," she said quietly, "I'm still not sure where we go from here. But I see that you're trying, and I appreciate that." He sat down beside her, careful to keep his movements unassuming. "I'll keep trying, Avellini. For you and for the baby." For the first time in months, Avellini allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. And as they sat together in the quiet warmth of her apartment, she felt a flicker of hope take root, small but undeniable. The days following Avellini's health scare brought a new rhythm to her life. James was a constant presence, helping in ways that didn't overstep her boundaries. He didn't push her for answers or demand more of her time. Instead, he simply showed up, picking up groceries, arranging for repairs in her apartment, and driving her to appointments. For Avellini, it was disorienting. She had spent so long shouldering everything on her own that accepting help felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But as the weeks passed, she began to see a consistency in James that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't trying to fix things with grand gestures or excuses. He was just there. One afternoon, as Avellini rested on the couch, James arrived with a small bag from a nearby bakery. "Thought you might like something sweet," he said, setting it on the table. She glanced at him, the faintest smile playing on her lips. "Thanks." He sat down in the chair opposite her, giving her space but remaining close enough to show he cared. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," she admitted. "But better." "That's good," he said, his relief evident. He hesitated, then added, "You know, you don't have to keep doing this alone." She looked at him sharply, her guard rising instinctively. But there was no judgment in his tone, no expectation in his gaze. Just a quiet sincerity that made her pause. "I've been alone for so long," she said softly. "It's hard to let someone back in." James nodded. "I understand. And I don't expect it to happen overnight. But I want you to know I'm here, Avellini. For you and for the baby." Her eyes softened, and she looked away, unsure how to respond. There was a part of her that wanted to trust him, to believe that this time could be different. But the scars from their past still lingered, reminding her of the man he used to be. A few days later, James invited Avellini to dinner. "Nothing fancy," he assured her. "Just a quiet meal at my place. No pressure." She hesitated, but something in his tone convinced her to say yes. That evening, as James cooked in his spacious kitchen, Avellini sat at the counter, watching him with curiosity. "I don't remember you ever cooking," she teased lightly. He chuckled. "I've had a lot of time to learn. Turns out it's pretty relaxing." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, touching on lighter topics, books Avellini had been reading, the changes James had made in his life since the divorce. For the first time in a long time, the tension between them seemed to fade, replaced by a tentative warmth. After dinner, James surprised her with a small gift, a hand-knitted baby blanket. "I found it at a boutique," he said, his voice almost shy. "It reminded me of something you'd like." Avellini ran her fingers over the soft fabric, her heart squeezing at the gesture. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's nothing," he replied. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. As the weeks turned into months, Avellini began to let her walls down, piece by piece. She allowed James to accompany her to more appointments, to be there for moments that mattered. One day, During an ultrasound, the doctor pointed out the baby's tiny heartbeat on the screen. "That's incredible," James whispered, his voice filled with awe. Avellini turned to him, surprised by the emotion in his expression. For the first time, she saw not just a man trying to make amends, but a father overwhelmed with love and wonder. Despite their progress, there were still moments of doubt. One night, as they sat in her living room, Avellini spoke the question that had been weighing on her mind. "What happens when things get hard again?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "You're here now, but what if that changes?" James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "It won't. I know I let you down before, Avellini, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I've changed. I'm not the same man I was. I don't want to miss another moment, not with you, not with our child." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time, Avellini allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. The day the baby arrived was nothing short of miraculous. Avellini had gone into labor early one morning, and James was by her side the entire time. He held her hand through every contraction, his steady presence a source of comfort she hadn't expected. When their daughter finally entered the world, her tiny cries filling the room, James felt a wave of emotion crash over him. He held her for the first time, his hands trembling as he gazed down at the little life they had created. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. Avellini watched him, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. In that moment, something shifted between them. The weight of their past no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier. Instead, it felt like a bridge, a connection that had led them to this point. Later, as James sat beside Avellini's hospital bed, cradling their daughter in his arms, she reached out and took his hand. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly. "But I'm willing to try. For her." James looked up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "So am I," he said. "For both of you." The weeks following the birth of their daughter were filled with a mix of exhaustion, joy, and quiet discovery. Avellini settled into her role as a mother with ease, her natural warmth and resilience shining through as she cared for the tiny, fragile life they had brought into the world. James, on the other hand, found himself navigating unfamiliar territory, learning to change diapers, soothe midnight cries, and juggle his work commitments in ways he never had before. For the first time in years, James didn't measure his success in deals closed or profits earned. Instead, his victories were small, personal. The first time his daughter, whom they had named Lily, wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, the way Avellini's smile softened whenever she watched him hold the baby, the quiet moments when they sat together, their shared exhaustion laced with unspoken gratitude. One crisp morning, James arrived at Avellini's apartment carrying a bag of groceries and a bouquet of lilies. He had been visiting daily, helping however he could, and though Avellini had initially hesitated to accept his presence, it had become something she looked forward to. "Are those for Lily or me?" Avellini teased, glancing at the flowers as she opened the door. "Both," James replied with a grin. He stepped inside, setting the groceries on the counter before turning his attention to Lily, who was nestled in her bassinet. Avellini watched as James carefully lifted their daughter, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were afraid of breaking her. The sight tugged at something deep within her. He was trying so hard, harder than she had ever expected, and for the first time, she began to wonder if they could truly build something new. "Tea," she offered, breaking the momentary silence. James nodded, still focused on Lily. "That would be great, thanks." As Avellini prepared the tea, she glanced back at him, her thoughts racing. She had spent so long keeping him at arm's length, afraid to let him back into her life. But seeing him now, his dedication, his quiet patience, she couldn't ignore the possibility that he had changed. Later that afternoon, as Lily napped, Avellini and James sat together on the couch. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. It was a rare moment of peace, and Avellini decided to break the silence. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant. "About us." James set down his cup of tea, his posture straightening as he met her gaze. Okay. I've spent so much time being angry with you, she admitted. And I think part of me held on to that because it was easier than facing the hurt. But, you've been here, James. You've shown me that you're not the same person you were back then. He listened intently, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with quiet hope. I don't want to push you, Avellini, he said softly. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to build a future with you, whatever that looks like. Avellini looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. I don't know if I'm ready to jump back into something serious. But I think I'm ready to take small steps. To see where this can go. James nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. Small steps. I can do that. The following weeks were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and rediscovering each other. They went on simple outings, walks in the park with Lily bundled up in her stroller, quiet dinners at Avellini's apartment, and afternoons spent reminiscing about the good moments they had shared before everything fell apart. Each moment was a step forward, a chance to lay a new foundation. One evening, as they sat together looking through old photos, Avellini came across one from their honeymoon. In the picture, they were sitting on the beach, their faces lit with carefree smiles. She handed it to James, her voice tinged with nostalgia. We were happy then, she said. James studied the photo, his thumb brushing over the worn edges. We were. And I think we can be again. Avellini didn't respond, but her silence wasn't one of doubt. Instead, it was filled with quiet hope, a fragile but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The first time James kissed her again, it was a quiet, unplanned moment. They had just put Lily to sleep, her soft breathing filling the small nursery. Avellini turned to him, her face illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. Before she could speak, James leaned forward, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was tentative, almost hesitant. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself lean into him, the weight of their shared history melting away in that single moment. When they broke apart, her cheeks flushed, she met his gaze and saw something she hadn't seen in years, love, pure and unwavering. Months later, as spring bloomed around them, James invited Avellini and Lily to his family's estate for a weekend getaway. The sprawling grounds were a far cry from her modest apartment, but Avellini found herself enjoying the quiet luxury, especially as she watched James play with Lily in the garden. As they sat together on the patio that evening, Lily asleep in a nearby crib, James reached for Avellini's hand. I never thought I'd get a second chance with you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. But I'm so grateful I did. Avellini squeezed his hand, her own heart swelling with gratitude. I think we both needed time to grow, she said. But I'm glad we found our way back. They sat together in comfortable silence, the stars twinkling above them. It wasn't a perfect ending, life rarely was, but it was a new beginning, filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future they would build together.